Special Branch and MI6 officer and the author of Black Ops.
I was undercover for Special Branch in jihadi organisation.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe for free.
My name is Carlton King, and welcome to the Black Spy Podcast, the show that shines a light on the world of secret intelligence, national security, and armed governmental personal protection operations, as well as the geopolitics that surrounds everything. This week is part 2 of the refugees question that we looked at last week. And for those who listened last week, if you haven't, go back and listen to part 1. But for those who did, you could see the complete difference upon how they were perceived. Now we're going in a little bit deeper this week, Firgas and I, into the reasons why that might be. And we're going to look at the class system in the United Kingdom and the media and their perception.
That's less clear because what we've got to look at, what we've really got to look at when we look at all these things, is there's one thing that is said, and this is why politicians work that way, and there's another thing that's done in reality. You know, if I really want to look at Brexit, okay, just to bring that in, and it's not coming off the subject, I would say the reason for Brexit more than anything else is because the European Union began to talk about closing down tax havens. And the vast majority of tax havens are either British, Guernsey, Jersey states, etc., the City of London, tax haven, right? Or are British dependents, Cayman Islands, Bahamas, or independent, so-called, but not really, ex-British colonies which still work to British rule. Right, now, why is that important? Because trillions upon trillions upon trillions of dollars are in these tax havens. And what the European Union wanted to do, and people might say it's sour grapes because they don't have it. Yeah, okay, that might be true. There's Luxembourg and there's Switzerland, which I suppose Switzerland isn't in the European Union. Neither is Luxembourg, but has got close liaison with both. These countries in the European Union said, we need to close this because it's undermining the middle classes of our countries, because the wealthy don't need to pay any taxes, because the wealthy basically send their money abroad. But they're not abroad, it's actually really here. Tax havens don't have any money, really. They just have the capacity to say it is there and tie it up with a load of string. And so people looking for it don't find it, and because of banking secrecy you can't see it. So the reality is that's why we have so many people in Britain from Russia, right, who, when the oligarchs, the ones who made it out, when communism died and capitalism came in, it was said that 12 people owned basically about 90% of the wealth of Russia, right, when Russia became a state rather than the Soviet Union, right. So these guys move their money to London. And many, many other people move their monies to London. People who we say we don't like. I could name you a whole load of people who we say we don't like, and their money sits in London, right? Or sits in these tax havens, which are administered from London. This is the reality of it. So what we say and what we do are two completely different things.
No,
So-
agreed. Right, but look, let's just go back to these people crossing the channel in a
the poorest of the poor.
in an inflatable dinghy, right?
Yeah.
Which no
Well,
one
they're not the poorest of the poor. Sorry, I should say they're not the poorest of the poor. The poorest of the poor are still sitting in South Africa in Turkey, in the Lebanon, in Mexico maybe, because they can't afford the money to pay the guys who are bringing them across.
Right. Okay.
It's the channel.
So look, let's look at the problems here, right? So the problems are, drowning, or human trafficking.
Well, they're all trafficked, aren't they? Some way, shape, or means.
Or you're in the back of a lorry and you will. Do you know what I mean?
You may perish. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So why? So my sort of mental conundrum, and again, I'm not. I'm just. This is just me as a person, me as a human asking this, right? If you can't seek asylum until you're in the UK, or until you're, as you've obviously just enlightened me, or until you're at an embassy or whatever, right? Why can't, surely it would be more beneficial to just run a ferry every day.
Right, the stock answer. The stock answer is.
But do you know what I mean? It's like.
Yeah. The stock answer from your Tory right wing is they're in France. Why don't they stay there?
I'm not coming.
Why don't they stay there? They're in France. Why don't they stay there?
I'm coming at this from the human point of view, right?
No, I understand what you're saying.
If the government are saying that you can't apply for asylum until you're on British soil, then surely they should make the passage to British soil safe.
The reason why you can't apply for asylum until you're on British soil is because they don't want you to apply. Right, so that is the reality of it. And that is not just me saying that. That is the Home Affairs Committee, who last week had sat in front of them the Home Secretary, who asked this very question that you're posing, right, said, I'll let my officials answer that question, because she didn't have a clue. Right, so this is what you've got. So the reality is this. They don't want people to apply. Now, the stock argument has always been, they're in France, why don't they claim for asylum in France? Many do. In fact, the vast majority do. In fact, very few actually come across the channel in comparison to who sit in France. And if you want to look at countries that are less wealthy than it, Greece, Turkey, so I should keep it to European Union. So let's say Greece, Spain, Italy, they all have vastly more amounts of refugees than we do, who've come across the Mediterranean and then sit in those countries. But what happens is, for those people coming to Britain, is because, as you said it, for 100 years, in some cases 300 years, they were part of the British Empire. So therefore they learnt English. Their grandparents, great-grandparents probably fought for the country somewhere away along the line, or at least give up the wealth to the country because it was all shipped back to Britain. And they think, and then they've got an uncle or a cousin or a great aunt or whatever sitting in Britain, and they think, why am I sitting in France when I can sit in Britain? So what actually happens is the French Empire, which was doing exactly the same, so let's not put France off there, we're taking monies out of the country. Those people who come from that empire generally sit back in France. They're happy with France. It's not a problem. Same for the Portuguese. They're happy in Portugal. They speak the language. They understand it. They understand the culture. They understand the system. What's happening is the others who understand the British culture want to make their way to Britain. That's why that happens. And who should know that better than Patel and all the others?
But isn't that a positive thing? But that's a positive thing. I mean, look. I mean, at the end of the day, the English Channel is what, 15, 20 miles long. It's not. Yeah. It's not big, right? I mean, I could probably run it, or I could definitely swim it, right? Right, but why? It's like there wasn't a refugee problem 10 years ago, but it's like Boris created one.
Well, one of the reasons why there wasn't such a refugee problem, because there was an agreement within the European Union. And that agreement was, I forgot the name. It's an island. Anyway, they made an agreement that basically said we take percentages of refugees. And that percentage of refugees is what was, and it's all split between all of the European Union, and they all take percentages. Obviously, once you jump out of the European Union, that's you done. You're not part of that agreement, right? The Dublin
Agreed.
Agreement. That was it. The Dublin Agreement. You're not part of that agreement. So therefore
agreed,
now,
but going back to your
the
earlier
people have to make their way.
Going back to your earlier point, what you're saying is that is that this was a political agenda to get Brexit over the line.
Correct. Originally, yeah. Absolutely and totally. Immigration was exactly pushed forward. And indeed, that's why we had the vote. Because, as you know, Farage did a great job from his perspective, and he had the Tory party wavering, and he was talking about next minute you'll have millions of refugees from Turkey running across. I don't see why Turkish people will be running across, but he said that. And by the way, I'll let you into a secret again. He was talking about Turkey coming into the European Union. Well, I'll tell you, the primary country who wanted Turkey in the European Union was not Germany, because they didn't want him in at all, not France, because they didn't want him in a bit less, not Holland, because they didn't want them in either, but Great Britain. And I've been with our Minister for Europe on several occasions to Turkey to try and get the Turks into the European Union. No other country was doing that. We wanted the Turks in. So what an absolute outrageous perspective was given when they were saying, oh, the European Union will be allowing the Turkish in against our will. No, it was British politicians who wanted the Turks in. Right? For one simple reason, that Turkey is part of NATO, and Britain's greatest power out with the European Union is NATO, because it sits with the American. Right? And so it wanted to keep the Turkish sweet. And keeping the Turkish sweet was keeping them in NATO and having power with the Turks, so we could control it. Which is why, of course, when all the other countries of the European Union in 2004 did not allow Poles, Czech Republic, all of the new accession states that came in, did not allow them into their country en masse until the 10 years was up, because there's a 10-year moratorium on people travelling. We in Britain allowed people in from day one because we wanted those Eastern European countries to vote with us within the European Union. And we then got a massive power base in the European Union by those countries, Poland, etc., 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 voting with Britain rather than voting with the German-French axis. So that was our power in the European Union, and we wanted that power. So, you see, this is a political game. It's never about the people. It's all about the politics.
Well, it's all about the politics, but actually then to circle back to the royals, right, to go back to the original conversation that we were having about the lady in waiting, right? Mm-hmm. And then Prince William came out today and he said that racism is never acceptable. Mm-hmm. And then, okay, great, good that he said that, but like, look, let's look at Meghan Markle.
Yeah.
In the royal family. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm a huge fan of hers. I'll say this. My children call her Meghan Sparkles. But actually,
not the first black woman in the royal family, by the way.
She's not the first black woman in the royal family, and also I sort of love her because actually she's a mix of German, English, and African, and so am I.
All mixes.
And so am I. So like
you've got the same mix.
So sometimes I look at her and I'm like, oh, yeah, you've had a bad hair day, but like I have a bad hair day as well. Because, right. Like I get it. Like I love her. I think she's amazing. But and I think that what the media has done to her is disgusting. And blah blah blah. But for Prince William to come out and say that racism, to call that out, knowing full well that his sister-in-law has been treated like that. I mean, that's a whole other conversation, but also, like, that's just, I mean, like, I don't know. I'm sure the media will find a new terminology before it, but it's like, royal washing or something, isn't it?
It's an interesting one when you mention this one again, and I'm with you with Meghan Markle. I'm with you how it is. I think it was always going to be difficult for a woman of colour in particular, who had her own strength and power. To come into a family that is going to orientate you towards their way of functioning without taking account about what you do as an individual. Now, I'm not hedging. I'm just putting it.
No,
putting it out
totally,
there.
I totally agree. But let's say, like, just imagine that the borders were all up. Let's imagine that we were back to the dictatorial times. We were back to the Roman times. Let's say Julius Caesar had, you know, like we were back to the old days, and there were actually barriers up, and every, in inverted commas, foreigner had to come over on a boat. So let's say that the second son to the King of England was getting his wife via a boat. Right? You know, I'm just saying, like, let's just sort of put this into historical context. If this was like that, right? You know, and if she was being shipped across on a boat or whatever, you know, like that's what it's like for these people who are just trying to connect with their heritage, of where they're from.
I see where you're coming from on that. Right, so let's look at the Roman. See, this is the difference. The Roman Empire, right, was an empire of all different types of people. That's the first thing what we need to understand. It was, you know, Italians, whatever they were not Italians as we see it today. They were from all over the place, and the empire did all sorts of deals with all sorts of people in order to keep power, from basically Africa to Asia Minor to the north. You know, the most northern parts of it actually were Britain, through other parts of Europe, and so it had a massive capacity to take in people from anywhere. And colour was not the decisive perspective. The decisive perspective was that you were a Roman, right? And a Roman was not identified with a colour. It was identified with a capacity, right? So that's why Rome could have an emperor who was black. Take into account, of course, that he ran a legion, and the legionnaires were loyal to him, and other guys were loyal to him, and he fought. And it was in the time when the civilians were losing power, etc., etc. But the point is that that's what it's all about. It's all about you carrying people forward with you, and they were able to do that. The difference is with now, we're identifying people based on colour, which, frankly, in the past, in many ways, wasn't necessarily the case until the African slave trade, and obviously Slavs. We get the word slave from Slavs, and they were white. But so for thousands of years, that's what was perceived as a slave. But the African slave trade, which we're really talking about, you know, 15th century, 16th century, were, and even then, frankly, it wasn't necessarily perceived only on colour. It's only when they start doing that in the New World, in the Americas, where that then becomes a problem, and then that then spreads itself back to, because European powers have taken that, spreads itself back to Europe. So in the beginning, we could be much tighter, and I can tell you that you know, top of my head, Napoleon had at least 12 generals who were black, right? One of them being the father of Alexander Dumas, who is the writer of the Three Musketeers, right? So it's and that was from a country that, you know, had Haiti and various other, Guadeloupe and various other enslaved areas, but nevertheless, you know, still had people who were chevalier, which means a count. So you had black counts, but you had slavery. So it's not all one way. We got to understand the history, but people don't.
Exactly. And also, Carlton, like we've talked a lot about the bigger picture. Like, let's. Have you had any one-on-one experience with refugees or
Absolutely.
migrants or,
Yeah,
or whatever that you
yes.
can share on this podcast, so we can make this a little bit
absolutely.
more personal.
Absolutely. I mean, obviously, I told you I was in the branch, and there was a section that did that. We used to look at individuals, but in those days, particularly, it was because of the Cold War and the refugees that we were looking at most closely. There were refugees from everywhere else, but the ones we looked at most closely were those who were saying they were refugees from Eastern Europe, because, of course, we always feared that some of them were Soviets, were Warsaw Pact spies. Okay, so they could be Germans and from the German
just
spies.
to clarify for your
So,
listeners, what would the implication of that have meant?
well, they wouldn't get asylum. You know, they wouldn't get asylum. I mean, you'd look at them and say, right, this person is probably a communist trying to infiltrate the United Kingdom, blah, 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 blah. And they wouldn't get asylum. So that's the way that was working. Now, we also had them from other places who were people who sometimes we thought of advantageously as a state and sometimes not. So you could say things like the Sudan example. You might get somebody from southern Sudan in those old days who'd come and say, you know, I'm a refugee, whatever, or from Libya, who we'd say, yeah, great, that guy's a refugee, well, an asylum seeker, and he got his asylum because he's from Libya, because we don't like Libya. So therefore, he would more likely get asylum than would somebody who was from a country that we liked. You see what I'm saying? So it's all politics. The politics is never out of it.
100%. Like absolutely, but
and as far as I should say, you asked me a question, so I should answer it. Sorry. And as far as the people are concerned,
you are answering it. You are
general asylum seekers. Now I'm talking proper asylum seeker now. And even let's be truthful. Even a migrant to a country because he's an economic migrant, frankly, 9 times out of 10, and I'll put that figure on it, 9 times out of 10, are actually what I call part of the talented 10. These are people who've taken it on themselves to get away from a problem, to make their way through to another land. These people generally want to succeed. And I tell you, in the country, they generally become people of power, unless, of course, they're held back. And, you know, we know that happens. But generally, these people will make it. These people will be very capable and will also push into their children a capability. They will make their children understand that to get on, you need to work hard. That's what I've seen with the vast majority of asylum seekers.
So look, if we were to put you back into police mode, right? Back into special branch mode,
Mm-hmm.
right? There are, like, let's say, you know, 2,000-3,000 refugees and migrants currently on the coast of France right now, wanting to come to the UK right now. Mm-hmm. How do you solve this problem?
You can only solve this problem
if you had ultimate power. How would you solve this power?
You can only solve this problem, and we'll obviously have to leave it at this because the timing's coming through. You can only solve this problem by superb liaison with your neighbour, which obviously is France in this case. And you need to work hand in hand with French authorities, both in terms of intelligence, indeed secret intelligence, and how to function against the people who are bringing folk here. You need to work out with the French what they can do for people who wish to seek asylum in France. And as far as I know, in a general rule, it's not necessarily negative seeking asylum in France, but they do have their problems. You then need to work with the French authorities to cut off the individuals who are providing the boats and the means of crossing and that will probably incorporate Belgians and Dutch and others, because the boats can come from anywhere across to make that action. You then need to work in a maritime mode with the French air sea and land police, and also with the French military, and our military, if there's a capacity there to use overflight aircraft to see where boats are coming in from. And it's a big old thing, but you can make it happen. So it's all about bringing together a system about how you do it, but you have to have the goodwill of the nation across the way. And you're not going to have that when you've just said to them, 2 fingers up to you, we want to leave you. And we don't want to take refugees in line with the Dublin Agreement, which everybody else made when we were part of you. And we're going to do our own thing because it's all about British sovereignty. So when you start saying that, it's all about our sovereignty and we're not going to work with you. And by the way, you can't look at our records anymore, right? Etc. etc. Yeah. Then there's no goodwill.
All right. So a question for you, Carlton, right? Because I asked the hard questions, right? If you were someone who had to flee their country, but had no ties to the UK, where would you recommend that they go?
See, it depends on a lot of things. If I'm fleeing my country and I've got capacity, I've actually got to think to myself, when I get in country, can I speak the language? And obviously, English is the lingua franca. So I don't care where you go in the world, English is the lingua franca. Really, if we wanted to be absolutely precise about it, English was the lingua franca from the 1920s, 1930s onward. Before that, it was French. But the reality is that it's now American. So the reality is probably, if I'm somebody looking for somewhere to go, I'm looking at an English-speaking country. And I probably might think the United States might take me. Canada might take me. Canada would be a good country I'd think of. Australia, but they're negative towards refugees and put you on Christmas Island if they can. New Zealand, countries that are speaking English, and Great Britain, of course. But if I've got other languages, I'd head towards Germany. Why wouldn't I? Germany's a great place to be. It's by far the most powerful country in Europe economically. So therefore, there's going to be more work. But I need the language. So there's a whole load of issues like that. Switzerland has been pretty good to some people. I can go on, so you'd look at places like that. There isn't something that would say I might not run across to Japan now, or to even try and run into China. What you need to understand is, or South Africa, what you need, depending on where I am, what you need to understand is that many places have capacity for refugees that we don't think about. I know some are now looking at Saudi Arabia, example, because they need more workers or whatever else. So you've got to look at it from that mode as to people thinking, where could I sustain a living? Now, the bigger problem comes.
And also,
I've got family.
You've just asked your own question as well. Like, why can't the UK sustain more refugees?
Because there isn't an appetite in the politics of the United Kingdom. And the Labour Party just says that very clearly. The Labour Party has gone down this Brexit route and doesn't want anybody. When in reality, and this is the anger I have, right? In reality, they're happy to delude nations' health services of the trained individuals. We're taking nurses from Tanzania, from Nigeria, from Kenya, from Philippines, from Thailand, people who need their nurses. We're taking them from those countries. They've been trained up by their countries at great cost to those countries. And then we entice them into the NHS. Right? So we are taking people, but the people we want, and deluding those countries, and then folk are dying in those countries because they don't have the health service capacity. So it's not a zero-sum game. This is something that's having great impact. What would I do? I'll tell you how I'd change the whole thing. I'd look around for a Marshall Plan. Right now, the Marshall Plan, for those who don't know, is after the Second World War. Senator Marshall made an agreement as an American to basically flood Europe with money, and Japan. I give them what they give money to Japan as well. Well, when I say Europe, I'm talking the United Kingdom, which was actually the greatest beneficiary of the Marshall Plan. By the way, people say, "Oh, Germany got all this amount." Great Britain got a lot from the Marshall Plan. And indeed, some of the debt relief from Lend-Lease stuff that we had from the Second World War. But of course, we used that money to fight colonial wars in various places, as did France. So the reality is that I would have a Marshall Plan for the what we euphemistically call the Third World, or now I think it's now called more like the Global South, for them to keep people back home. So in order to work systems that allow people to stay back home, right? Could you imagine if China hadn't controlled its system, hadn't had the one child system, hadn't increased its capacity to look after its people? Could you imagine there'd be 1.5 billion people looking around trying to find somewhere to live, right? But no, what China did is looked after its people. Now what are we doing with China? Because we're jealous of its capacity, we're now calling it down. Because it's like the second most powerful country in the world and soon likely to be the first most powerful country in the world. We keep, it's communism. Listen, communism, what a joke. That thing is state capitalism. It's a capitalist country by all but name, right? And the reality is that actually what we don't want, what we should be wanting, is to create other Chinas elsewhere where people stay at home. Let them stay at home. Let them have the capacity to live a very, very good life. Because most people don't want to leave their family. Most people want to stay at home. Let them have a capacity to live a good life back home. But that means for us, actually, we pledge all this money for stopping desertification, stopping deforestation, etc. When we actually pledge it, not just the pledges, which never come to the fore, actually giving the money, actually making that it happens. Yeah. And if necessary, bring it down to the level of people doing it rather than to the governments, who we have corrupted, by the way. We've corrupted the governments in order to get stuff cheap out of them. So they then get the money and pass it back to London and put them back in, as I said previously, back into London in the city. No, what we should be doing is going right to the people down at the bottom, to the villages, the towns, etc., and let those people work with them to build up in those lands, because they've got the ability and capacity, they just don't have the money.
Well, yeah,
that's how you change it.
But also, I mean, like, I've got 4 children. Like it's so different. It's not really any different. You need the government support for every child. Correct. It doesn't matter if like why restricts why marginalize human capacity to say you have to have one child in order.
Well, the Chinese did that for a specific reason.
Yeah, well, I know.
They basically looked and said you'd have 3 points.
I get it. But what I'm saying is that that when you contextualize that into the refugees coming into the country, right? Why we don't know, like Britain doesn't. Boris has pretended that our limits are our limits, but we don't know what our limits are, right? There's hundreds of acres of land in Britain that is sort of uncharted. There's loads of space. There's exponential amount of stuff that we can do, and if Julius Caesar were to march back onto the British land right now, armed by a bunch of Ukrainian refugees and a bunch of other refugees from other nations or whatever, like, given what Britain is right now, there's so much potential to make it so much more.
Listen, I hear what you're saying. And the reality is why, when I said Germany took millions, and it did, the reason why Germany took millions is because Germans weren't producing children, right? And the population was aging, and there was nobody to do the jobs that would create, under the systems that we have presently, that would create the tax base for them to pay the pensions of the older people. Right, now, that's exactly the problem that the Chinese have now got. Because they basically are, I think I'm not incorrect in saying that when they brought in the one-child policy, they basically had looked and seen and mathematicalized the situation, and they realized that if they didn't bring in the one-child population, they'd have something like 3.5 billion people, right? So they had to dump the numbers. But the problem now is that's been so successful that there aren't the young people now to look after the old people when that happens in 20, 30 years' time. Japan's already reached that. Japan already does not have the young people to stabilize its system. So they're building robots to look after old people, right? Britain does not have the young people it requires who are willing to do the jobs, which is why you're seeing them trying to bring people in to get stuff out of the fields. Right now.
That's funny. That's interesting, Carlton. Because as you know, I've done loads of work in Croatia.
Yes.
And in the former Yugoslavian war,
mm-hmm.
And obviously the end result was that Serbia, was to blame, but they couldn't afford to pay the war debt.
Mm-hmm.
So there were so many people in Croatia and Bosnia, etc., who were in a situation where they knew that they'd fought for their country, they were owed money, their house had been destroyed, but there was no way that they were going to get the money back.
Mm-hmm.
So they were just it was just a huge decade of depression.
Mm-hmm.
But what the younger generation did, and this was amazing, really, what the younger generation did was they all went, right, okay, brilliant. You know what? I'm 19 years old, but no one is running MTV Croatia, so that job's up for grabs. I'm gonna go for it and get it. Or, hey, I'm 16 years old, no one's running national radio, I'm going to go for it, get it. So the younger generation just sort of took over it all, because the middle generation had been so depressed by the whole war decimation.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it was amazing. It was so inspirational. I mean, God, there's this, the guy, I mean, I won't name him, but the guy who ran Croatian MTV and still runs Croatian MTV, I met him and he was 19 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And he just decided that he was like, it was up for grabs, But
I mean, what happens is, as you know, and you're explaining there.
But, the thing was that there was a debt that could never be repaid.
Well, you see, the first thing is we perceive that Serbia was at fault. As we know, there was a union of the Yugoslavs under Tito, and once Tito basically died, then, and this is the way I would see it, I would personally see it. Once Tito actually died, what happens is there's no glue to keep that union together. And politicians, let me put it this way. If as the top dog in a company, you get a car and you get the top seat and you get the best hotels and everything's hunky-dory and great food and that, etc., and you're top dog, but there's only one top dog, then, you're fighting for that one place. If, of course, you can turn around and say, actually, that's a Serbian, that's a Montenegrin, that's a Croatian, that's a Slovenian. So already now, there's 5 top places, right? So 5 folks can get a top car, get a thing, blah, 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 blah. I know it sounds silly, but this is what you're talking about. And politicians look
totally
to look
agree.
after themselves. And the public, unfortunately, follow them. And then, subsequently, they think, well, what was that war about? So, Fergus, what I'm going to ask you now, because I'm looking at timings and as usual, we've said so much that the time's running on, but I do want to ask you this. I want to ask you a question. Why is it that the media now are so fearful of going into depth on practically anything? That's my question.
Well, when you say going into depth, what you mean is going into depth in the same way that you would go into depth. And also now, because I know you, the same way that I would go into depth as a criminologist or, as an officer investigating evidence. The media at the moment there's a huge tranche of the media that unfortunately depends on clickbait.
Right.
So whilst all the newspapers, and I will stand up for all the newspapers, including the red tops here, right? I will say that every single story that runs in a national newspaper has to go through the lawyers, right? And if there's any sort of, gravitas or anything, that there is a policy. I know people might think that a journalist can just write what they like, but they can't. And especially in news journalists, they can't. It has to go through. It has to go through a fact check. It has to go through the subs. It has to go through the lawyers. Now, that might not be as robust as the police system, but it is a system that's in place. It is a system that's in place. So the short answer really is every story should be told, and everyone should have the courage to tell their story. And what I'd love is that if any refugees have been listening to this podcast, or anyone that's from a blended background, or anyone that's come to England from a different heritage, or anyone who just feels like society has challenged them in any way to be a part of Great Britain, come and be a guest on the show.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I just put something to you though? You've spoke about rigor, yeah, because that's basically what you're saying. There's a rigor.
Yeah.
So why is it then that Rebecca Brooks, as we know, one of the highest paid editors, yeah, why is it she could turn around and say she knew nothing about royal stories, etc., that were coming through? Because surely, if the rigor is there, as you're saying, what she should have said is, would you get that story about the royals from?
Oh,
Would you get that story about, what's he called, the fellow who bought the cases?
Let's do a whole nother show on Rebecca Brooks.
Let's do it. Fergus, that was brilliant. Listen, thanks once again. We've gone way over time. We're going to cut her into 2. So we got some idea about refugees, the way it works, and the connection with the story which we had about the royals as well, and how that all intertwines. So what I want to do is basically thank you again for coming up with the episodes. And all I can really say is, can I have you back on again next time?
Yeah, for definite. But also, what I want to say to everyone listening, okay, if please tell us, look, let's make an open conversation about this, right? Okay, I'm part German, part South African, and yet I identify as British, right? I'm not British. I'm not British, right? Tell us about your heritage. Come on, just post us thing. Just tell us. You know, we want to hear. We're excited to hear. We're not judgmental. We just want to know. We want, you know, we're all about all of you, and we'd love to talk to all of you as well.
Totally agree. I know you've got to put the kids away for the night. So listen, thank you very much. And once again, Firgas, all the best. And ladies and gentlemen, hopefully we'll see you again next week.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe for free.
Here is a working class spy telling his stories, the secrets, the lives of spies. Feel free to message Carlton King on all socials and give this show 5 stars on Apple iTunes and subscribe so you never miss a single episode. For your ears only.
I was a member of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence.